We've evolved beyond it. You're exactly right. We've evolved beyond it. We don't need to eat meat, right? Animals do need to eat meat. Wow, that was wow. Right? You know?
Hello.
Hey, welcome.
Welcome to Left Unread. My name is Aaron.
I'm Will.
We are two dudes engaged in a radical self-education.
That's right. We're two social embodiments of value acting in the abstract.
Very nice. This go-round, we have read Beyond Nature, Animal Liberation, Marxism, and Critical Theory by Marco Maurizi.
Yeah, Marco Maurizi. He's a philosopher and historian from Rome, Italy originally. He's written numerous papers with a focus on animal liberation, critical theory, dialectical thought, the conflict between man and animal, as well as a few books, including I Was a Teenage Critical Theorist, Zappa, Nagai, and Romero. He also does terrible Bandcamp beats, I found. So, Marco Maurizi, if you hear this, I'm sorry.
It did occur to me, I was like, I wonder, because this is a niche enough book, that I wonder if he's going to find his way to this episode.
I hope that someone with such a philosophical perspective is not mired down in like the name searching game, you know? I will say though, not to toot my own horn, but my rating alone brought this book up on Goodreads from a 3.1 to a 3.18. So, Mr. Maurizi, you're welcome.
You're welcome for that 0.08 boost.
That's right. I did the math and everything. I was like, I wonder.
One side note, this is a Haymarket book, and I think it's the only of his books to be translated into English. I couldn't find any other writings of his that have been translated directly into English.
None at least that pertain to our conversation.
Yeah, I mean, all of the other stuff that you find on like academia.org or whatever, where it has the list of all of their scholarly publications, are chapters from this book.
Yeah,
you know, so
yeah. I did note that a couple of these chapters were originally published somewhere else.
I think that's what's happened.
Kind of retooled, yeah. But hey, get your bag, man.
Yeah, for sure.
What can I say?
Okay, first and foremost, I think this is going to be an interesting episode where we're obviously discussing veganism and its relationship or contentious relationship with Marxism. And for those of you that are not aware, I think it's apropos to start with a definition of speciesism, just to throw it out there and make it clear. This is a definition that I actually pulled from the text, though it's largely a definition adapted from Peter Singer's definition, which Maurizi has contention with. But nonetheless, the definition of speciesism that I think we should use for our conversation comes from page 40 of the text. A mental habit which measures everything from the standpoint of humanity, in which animals are always considered ontologically and morally inferior. It's anthropocentrism personified, I guess.
Sure. Listener, you might be asking why did we choose this book? And I think that if you've been, in tune with our last couple of episodes at least, the answer might seem pretty obvious. But we've kind of been exploring maybe the boundaries of oppression, so to speak, in some of our more recent readings, right? Some of the different avenues of oppression that exist within this system that we live in. And I'm not a vegan, but Aaron is. And I think that it just poses a really interesting question. I mean, we've already seen flavors of things I'm sure we'll discuss today, and when we read like Marcuse and things about how the domination of nature may, in fact, lead to the domination of man. And so it's just a critical question to keep in our minds, maybe, as we're moving forward with this project. Even if it's just important at the very start to just understand that we're having this as an open and kind of abstracted mindset, where we're talking about the actual fundamentals of exploitation and oppression, the basis of our systems of production.
Yeah, I mean, anyone that's listened to enough episodes of this show will know that the veganism question has come up many times, largely because I'm always on my vegan shit. And I think it is a blind spot in all of the theory that we've read thus far. I think it is a question that bears examination. It's something that bears analysis. And personally, I think that the animal liberation movement presents an opportunity for liberatory politics to move beyond the kind of uber intellectualism that often the sort of stuff that we've been reading gets kind of mired in.
Yeah.
And so I was really interested in finding something that explicitly explored the connection between animal liberation and Marxism. And this is the book that seemed most willing to do that.
At the very least, it's a book that we already have built somewhat of a foundation for, Like, we have a foundation for animal liberation in your case, right? We have a foundation in critical theory already where we've seen different avenues of this. And I think we are obviously have a foundation in Marxism. So, I think it's pretty natural we chose a book like this.
Yeah. I think the fun thing about us approaching our reading of Capital the way that we've been reading it is literally every time we're reading something that's not Capital, I'm like, that just came up in Capital.
Perfect stuff.
Yeah. And so it's just, I don't know, it's working out really well. And yeah, I was hearkening back a lot to our reading of Marcuse, our failed reading of Adorno. While reading
maybe I think maybe we had just picked the wrong Adorno, perhaps. But yeah, I do want to say we're exploring this because there's a personal connection here, right? You're vegan. But the point of that is that there are still avenues of oppression that we've overlooked. There's still avenues of liberation which we have yet to explore. I don't want you, listener, to think that we're jumping to animal liberation as this panacea, right? As this end-all and be-all silver bullet. If we uproot this oppression, then all other oppressions will come with it. We're not taking a reductive stance here. We're simply exploring this as something that's been untouched in our theory so far, because there are still definitely people who are oppressed that fall into categories of oppression that we haven't looked at. I'm thinking specifically of disability, but even like children. Well,
that was actually kind of my point about the child labor stuff, is that I said I guess it was the last episode, there are implications to our reading of this and our interpretation of child labor that move beyond the issue of child labor. And I was largely thinking of its expansion toward animal liberation and the other forms of marginalization and oppression and subjugation that are often discussed when talking about animal liberation, like disability, as an example.
Yeah, and I think that this is certainly something we'll talk about, especially when we're addressing the viewpoints of the critical theorists. But I think part of the reason that animal liberation might be so fraught to talk about, and this is something that's certainly addressed by the viewpoint of the critical theorists, is that it is so expansive to our society. It's so historical. I mean, the magnitude, the connection that humanity has with animals is essentially the baseline of our history, as Maurizi puts it here, history with a capital H rather than a natural history, so to speak. And I think that he does so much to talk about it here where there's like a fear of the return, and it's because this oppression necessarily, this exploitation is undergirding our society in a way that to deal with would be actually to shake the foundations of society. And that's something that we as communists are already quite a little bit accustomed to, believe it or not.
Open to.
Yeah. And so I think that it's quite telling that even, very staunch revolutionists, very staunch anti-capitalists are still uncomfortable with the idea of animal liberation in that sense because it really attacks the foundation. I mean, it's critical of themselves.
I have many, many thoughts on that matter.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to this one.
Yeah. You had mentioned before we started the episode that it might make sense for me to kind of talk about my experience with veganism or anti-speciesism, what brought me to it and what my history is with it, I guess. Yeah. And so I might have mentioned this or some bits of this in the episode 1 when we were kind of talking about our radicalization, I guess. What's interesting, I guess, my history with veganism, I went vegetarian when I turned 18, which was 22 years ago. And I've been vegan for the last 10 of that. I went vegetarian with the intention of going vegan, and then it took me 12 years to do it. So, don't do that. If you're considering going vegan, it is much, much easier to just go vegan, just go cold turkey. This kind of temperance attitude of like drips and drabs.
Weaning yourself off.
Yeah, doesn't work, or it didn't work for me. Nonetheless, I went vegetarian at that time largely because I was deeply invested in studying philosophy. I was doing all of this on my own, just doing reading by myself. And I found as a pretty clear and natural extension of the ideas I had about justice and the ideas I had about morality, I guess, to include animal liberation or anti-speciesist attitudes as a part of that. Now, I went vegetarian, which I knew was still quasi-hypocritical. Not to come at any of my vegetarian comrades or anything like that, but the dairy industry and the poultry industry are probably the two most exploitative industries in the great complex of factory farming. And so to continue to eat milk, butter, cheese, and eggs is, in my opinion, very hypocritical. To have an attitude, an anti-speciesist attitude, and still continue to be a lacto-ovo vegetarian is dumb. I don't know a better way to put it.
Yeah.
It's intellectually inconsistent. And I came to that around that time studying philosophy, And I would be remiss if I didn't say that I was also like heavily influenced by a lot of the music that I was listening to. The band that I probably credit with making me think about veganism is Propagandhi. I was introduced to Propagandhi through a record called Less Talk, More Rock, and there's the second song on the record is called Nailing Descartes to the Wall. It's very much a song about anti-speciesist veganism. And I would hear that song and agree with it and always feel guilty. And I could never reckon with those feelings. I could never reconcile those with my action. And so ultimately I decided I had to become vegan. And that's how I found my way to veganism. In the context of this book, where the first part is all about animal rights activists and vegan writers, I found all of that I've had exposure to. I found all of that after I went vegan. The writings of people like Peter Singer and Gary Francione were not what led me to veganism.
Sure.
I found veganism and found those writers through veganism as a means of trying to like better educate myself and be more kind of equipped to have meaningful conversations with people about it. Because I think one of the most legitimate criticisms against veganism that Maurizi certainly spends a large chunk of the first part of the book kind of leaning into is the moral abstraction that comes around why people are vegan and the political implications of that, or the lack of political implication of that.
Yeah, it was a big question on my mind going into this, just because when we had talked about veganism previously, there was always that kind of moral aspect to it.
Yeah.
So I was interested to hear.
Yeah, what's interesting to me, I guess, is that I have always seen veganism as an inherently political attitude, which is not to be a super pretentious asshole about it, but it's the distinction between being plant-based and being vegan. Being plant-based means you're not eating animals. Being vegan means you are seeking the liberation of all animals. And so, like, there is an inherent politicism to that, in my view, even though Maurizi doesn't seem to share that. So, yeah, I guess that's a very bungled, muddled history of veganism.
Well, I appreciate you talking about it, just because I think that, many of our listeners probably don't have any foundation for veganism other than the cliches they hear on the internet. So
my own experience as a vegan, even before I was vegan, to some degree does reflect the kind of attitudes of animal rights activists that Maurizi brings up here, though I think oftentimes he's setting up straw men as a kind of caricature of veganism.
Yeah.
But certainly coming up in the punk scene and meeting anarcho crust vegan punks.
Hell yeah.
They were kind of insufferable. And so, like, I get why people might have kind of a knee-jerk reaction against veganism because of their personal interactions with other vegans, but
well,
doesn't discredit the point.
I just want to pull the parallel, so many people have that kind of gut reaction to communism as well.
Yep.
And it's because we're right. No, but I think that there is an interesting parallel there, To what extent really are we willing to attack the foundations of oppression?
Yeah, and I mean, I think about it all of the time, but it's so easy for us to look outward when we think about oppression and subjugation and not turn the mirror inwards and consider the ways that we are, if not only complicit, are actually driving the forces of subjugation that we participate in ourselves.
Yeah.
And veganism is a very clear indicator to me of the way that we individually perpetuate systems of subjugation and oppression. Even though I agree with Maurizi that an individual solution is ultimately going to fail, I don't think individualism is ever going to be the correct political attitude. I do still think like there are personal implications, which is why I became vegan.
Sure. Yeah, and something that Maurizi says, which I agree with, is that it's not that veganism should be abandoned, right? It's simply that it's insufficient. It's not that the method of being vegan is an issue. That's not the problem, obviously. In fact, it's clearly a step towards the kind of ideal that we're looking for. It's just that I think his argument is more so that the action of being vegan doesn't necessarily, like the opposite of you were saying, basically carry with it a political implication.
Hello all, Editor Aaron here. As I was cutting this episode together, I found at a few moments during this episode that I didn't properly illustrate my position, and for an issue so important to me especially, I became increasingly uncomfortable with leaving things so ambiguously articulated. Thus, you'll catch me punching in a few times during this episode to clarify my points. I'll ring the bell each time I do for transparency around when I'm punching in after the fact versus when Will and I were recording together on the day. Back to the show. Yeah, which kind of, I mean, we should probably just jump into part one then, because that brings me to my first 2 points about it.
Yeah, let's do it.
I will say, this is just a quick point, but number one, I think that Maurizi, side note, as an Italian, Maurizi?
Hey,
I'm just saying Maurizi.
I'm just letting it flow, as per usual.
Okay, sorry to all of our Italian listeners. Sorry to Will.
I'm at least some portion Italian. I don't do the math.
There's something about it that seems...
What, racist to put a little accent on it?
To really lean into it.
To follow the...
Maurizi.
Okay, buddy. I'm not saying it's a me. Okay. I'm just following the traditional linguistic rules and applications of the phonemes. Thank you very much, Aaron.
Okay, well, Maurizi, I think...
No. Okay, fine.
Yeah, I think he, maybe as a tactical point, does start with a critique of ARAs to lull MLs into going along with his ultimate argument of synthesis, which I think is very smart. But the real thing I wanted to say about part one is that I think part one is definitely structured as a legitimate criticism of the politicization or lack of politicization of the animal rights movement, which I agree with, and I think he brings up quite a few points. I'll start on page 64, if that's okay.
Yeah, absolutely.
Here this isn't even him. He's quoting an animal rights activist best. He's talking about Gary Francione. Francione ultimately pushes a simplistic, apolitical, quiescent, go-vegan approach pitched to a marginal, white, affluent, and privileged Western audience. He rarely engages people of color, working-class families, the poor, or peoples in China or India, the world's most populous and rapidly modernizing nations whose insatiable appetites for meat pose massive problems for vegan abolitionism and, indeed, the planet. He identifies the problem as one of individual demand for, not institutional supply of, animal products. I 100% agree with that criticism of the animal rights movement, but there's still a part of me, maybe I'm just being defensive, but there's a part of me that feels a little bit like he's punching down. Like, I'm choosing to read this as an appeal to vegans and animal rights activists to theoretically expand their praxis, and not as an appeal to Marxists to shit on animal rights activists for never extending their moralism into some sort of real practical political theory. Sure. But I felt through the whole first part where he is lobbing what I think are mostly legitimate criticisms of animal rights activism as a little bit like, you're fighting the wrong people, It felt a little bit like punching down.
Yeah. I'm thinking about what you said about how he's doing it to lull MLs into a sense of security. It's a question of who the audience is for this book, right? Yeah. Because whereas earlier we were saying that it's a bunch of academic pieces put together, I think that it does some work to appeal to a more average reader, It's a
challenging read for sure.
Yes, I agree with you. But I do think that he lays some groundwork for a layman to more so be able to understand it. And I think that this section was really helpful to me, especially because I hadn't heard any of the arguments of veganism in an academic sense, outside of like the most common sense ones, basically. So even if this has a bit of a bent to it, obviously, it was helpful for me to see at least the viewpoints of animal rights activists, even if it was then immediately rebutted.
Yeah, and I will admit I didn't have exposure to all of the writers that he's referencing here. Certainly Singer and Francione are the two that I've known for years. Peter Singer is the animal rights activist writer. He literally wrote the book. It's called Animal Liberation.
Yeah, plays a mean banjo too.
Yeah. So yeah, I knew them, and as an extension of my own philosophical thinking or moralistic thinking, I have drawn parallels between the feminist movement and the vegan movement because I think the question of bodily autonomy is an important pillar to both of those movements, and it seems to me that there is a very clear overlap. I didn't know that there were writers, the eco-feminist writers that he mentions here. I hadn't had exposure to them previously either. But at the very least, yeah, this is a nice overview of the animal rights activism of the last 50 years.
And just to expand on his critique of the individual consumer, I mean, there's a point he makes later about how they serve to fill a niche in the capitalist system anyway. Yeah. I think there's an aspect of assimilation that ends up happening regardless. It goes back to that sense of the alternative being assumed into the mainstream, right?
Yeah, recuperation.
The counterculture is there only to be held as that kind of negation, but it's still capitalized on. So I don't know. I mean, that's what kind of spoke to me in the critique of an individual veganism in that sense, because I think I agree with him when he's saying that it's more so a supply side problem necessarily. Especially when he's talking about these developing nations. To me, it goes back to the idea of that historical necessity. In our narrowly delineated animal exploitative minds, the most efficient way for those people to be fed is through an expansion of the system of meat production. even though you obviously could make the argument that you could use the land that you feed the animals with to feed the people. That aside, there is an aspect of that kind of currently available material necessity that I think does speak to me in terms of the modern day.
Yeah, I think that's largely the analogy that he draws to human chattel slavery, especially in the later half of the book.
I don't want to get too far ahead of myself, but I'm just thinking about when they're talking about slavery as a precondition to society and the slavery of animals being a precondition to the development of society as well. You know, it just kind of expanding that idea out to its logical conclusion on the basis of animal oppression. That I think was really powerful to me because when you put it in the lens of human oppression, it's simple to say, what the fuck, get rid of this shit. You know, this is obviously evil. What is preventing us from doing the same for animals?
Yeah, but that is something that was sitting as a discomfort in my stomach reading the whole thing, is that I think there's this reticence to have any sort of value judgment or moralism as a part of a Marxist politic is, I think, stupid. I don't know. I know I'm going to catch a lot of shit for all the stuff that I have to say about it on the show, but you just even pointed to something there, which is like when we see it as human oppression, we see that as wrong, as evil. We're making value judgments. Because we should.
Yeah. Well, I think it's explained in here. I mean, we'll come back. But it's in the magic of things. The magic, the mythos is there as a means of separation. We are separating ourselves from the animal in a way where we can justify their exploitation. You know, and exactly in the same way which he says that fascists use dehumanization, animalization as a means of genocide, you know, because that separation is the barrier for committing that kind of amoral violence.
Yep. Animalization of humans is always a part of the dehumanization of that particular group of humans.
Yeah, and that's not by accident, obviously.
Yeah.
So, but we'll touch back on that, I'm sure, in part 3. Sorry to spiral off there. How else did you feel about part 1?
I will say, I just want to, I guess, really hit this point that his attitude about confining the struggle of animal rights activism to the individual, I think it does open the movement to legitimate criticism. And I don't want to discount those criticisms because I think they are valid. But I would caution you, listener, if you heard anything that we just said and be like, well, yeah, it's just that's part of the larger system. Me choosing not to eat meat isn't going to do anything about it. I would argue that what you're doing is exercising a deflection. And even though the criticism is valid, that is not a reason to deny veganism on an individual level. I have another quote for that.
Okay.
On 83, towards the middle of the page, he says, "For sure, we can bring some spark of liberation into the world in our small daily gestures, but we could never fully live the possibilities of a liberated world." And so I recognize that me choosing not to participate in the dairy industry isn't going to dismantle the dairy industry because I, as an individual, do not have the collective power necessary to dismantle that system. It was collectively developed. It must be collectively dismantled.
Yeah.
But what we can do, we should do.
Now, I want to take a second here and talk about ideal veganism, right? Because this is a question that is only really touched on here in his idea of going beyond nature. And it's the fact that obviously a bunch of the discomfort with that kind of deflection, I think, stems from people not wanting to change their behaviors, obviously. And the question in my mind is how much really do those behaviors need to be changed? Obviously, I think that the current way we interact with animals is oppressive, exploitative, etc. But in this hypothetical world, if we had like all lab-grown meat, right, all of our animal products were replaced with an identical but unexploitative process, whatever that may be, in our beautiful space communism, that seems as if it would be acceptable as part of veganism. You know, that's like as part of the ideal of veganism, meaning animal liberation instead of plant-based consumption. I just want to temper that idea because I think that, you know, I'm trying to say you can have your cake and eat it too, is basically what I'm trying to say, is that in a beautiful future, there is a possibility of consuming meat in this sense. See, it's like I'm trying to fucking do devil's advocate work for like bourgeois individualism here. But basically I'm saying is that the consumption of meat is not the issue. The consumption of animal products is not necessarily the issue. It is a portion of the larger problem, which is our relationship to animals, you know? And I just think that a big portion of this book, it requires you to separate those two ideas in your mind. Or maybe one of them is more elaborated on in a metaphysical sense, where he's talking about this ideal beyond nature state where we can go beyond our current modes of production in relationship with animals and still have this ideal veganism in mind. Really, I just don't want the listener to completely discount veganism because they think it's going to fundamentally change their life in that way. Because I'm saying that if your limited ideal of veganism is simply switching to a plant-based consumption, that's not necessarily what we're talking about here. There is still a veganism that allows for the consumption of animal products. That's such a gray area to be in because it's completely abstract. It's completely in the future. It's outside of even our current technological capability, perhaps.
That's where I was getting a little bit lost. So, like, the idea of technology developing to the point where we have, like, lab-grown meat or something like that, which I have kind of fraught feelings about, but largely I would say I support.
Sure.
Because it means we're not breeding more animals
Right.
for their exploitation and commodification. If that's the sort of thing that you mean, like where technology and society can advance to the point where we are no longer subjugating or holding dominion over nature because we have become returned to being a part of nature once again, not in a primitivistic sense, but you know what I mean, where we have a non-domination driven relationship with other animals, human animals and non-human animals coexist. I'm down with that. That is what I would qualify as an ideal veganism. Yeah. That is also where it gets kind of complicated in the modern day as a vegan because, like you'd already mentioned before, vegan products being brought to the market and being kind of recuperated into a point where it's just a new market to be exploited. It doesn't do anything to change the market that previously existed, which is true. They have done some longitudinal studies to show that meat consumption hasn't gone down, even though the consumption of non-meat alternatives has gone up. That just means that the people that were just choosing not to eat meat are now choosing to eat non-meat alternatives because they've been brought to the market.
Yeah.
It's not doing much, if anything, to change people from being omnivoric meat eaters to eating the non-meat.
Yeah, it's just making those people's lives easier. It's not that it's changing anybody's attitudes necessarily. Yeah,
which is why a reformation of the system that underlies it is what is also necessary for that ideal veganism to be realized.
Yeah, what I'm trying to square is the space in between, right? Your individual action of becoming vegan and this ultimate ideal of veganism, because the steps in between are unclear to me. And this is obviously, I think, part of the larger discussion in terms of the practical steps, which, again, we'll have to return to later. So, I don't know.
Yeah, well, I mean, maybe I'm off base here. The only thing that I have to say about that is one of the common rebuttals that you hear from omnivores that call themselves carnivores because they don't understand what words mean.
Because we're based.
And are arguing against veganism, they'll always pull out some random indigenous group that fish and have fished for centuries. And it's like, okay.
Yeah.
They're like, so if you are going to suggest that I can't eat meat, then you should suggest that they can't eat meat. My suggestion is you're getting your shit from fucking Meijer, from Kroger or whatever. It's not the same thing. Let's, in the meantime, let them continue to fish and do what they got to do to survive. You're not a part of that. Let's fix this part.
Yeah.
Yeah, and before anyone gets it in their heads, hunting for sport isn't the same thing, and it is not morally permissible. Choosing to hunt when one's survival does not depend on it is not morally permissible. Back to the show!
Go out there if you want to do that.
Yeah, there's going to be a transition phase where not everyone is a true vegan.
Yeah, there is something in my mind, though, about... Because I'm just thinking about the domestication of animals, like the state of animals has been changed by us.
Mm-hmm. Because they've been commodified largely. Yeah.
Right. I guess I'm asking to what extent does that need to be reversed? To what extent is that an exploitative relationship instead of maybe a symbiotic one? And I know that that's a fraud argument already, but that's kind of what I'm getting at there.
Yeah, I get that completely. And I feel that way. I've already kind of expressed something to you similarly. In my house, we cohabitate with 2 dogs and a cat.
Right.
Our dogs are vegan, by the way, have been their whole lives. Well, since we got them, that they were adopted. But there's already an inherent relationship dynamic there, a hierarchical relationship dynamic there that I'm not particularly comfortable with, even though both of these dogs are domesticated animals.
Yeah.
They're not animals that could or would survive in animalia out at large. So we're doing, I think, the best thing we can do, which is to provide them safe haven in a home where they are loved and cared for. Our cat, same sort of thing, but cats are obligate carnivores. And so the question of a vegan diet for our cat has been a contentious one in this house because I kind of want to do it, but that's also, I can't say that that's the right call.
Yeah.
And our cat is already advanced in years. He's old as hell. And so, like, how is that going to play into it if we try to switch his food?
Yeah.
He was also a rescue.
Yeah.
This is a situation where thought we were doing something good, but now we're perpetuating systems where we have to buy cat food that isn't vegan. And it's like, ah!
I just had, like, the horrid thought about harm reduction, and I'm trying to decide if it's worth bringing up here, you know, because it's like, that's kind of the argument we're making here, right? There's less harm in that. I don't know, especially when you think about cats, because when you let a fucking cat outdoors, it becomes this horrid apex predator that shreds environments and decimates wildlife. So, like, yeah, this is certainly maybe the best option for all the domestic cats that we have. So
our antipathy toward cats, though, is a large part of why we have such a feral cat problem, though. Like, the idea that we have domesticated these animals and then just let them run free, and so they're just fucking all the time and just creating more and more animals that need support. People that are kind-hearted and conscientious might try to do something to help the feral cats, or at least feed the feral cats. We have a handful in our neighborhood. We have a kitty condo in our backyard that we built for the cats to have a place to live.
We've got 2 outdoor cats that are basically ours, you know?
Yeah, we created that problem. The solution isn't particularly easy, though, either.
Right. It's a more complex answer than I think anyone is going to advocate for necessarily right now.
Yeah.
I don't know when to bring this thought up. It's not a bad point right now. You know what this whole thing reminds me of is the vanguard. Are we advocating for humans to be the vanguard of animals? Animals that decide to liberate other animals, right? That's something we haven't said so far, listener, but that's a big point of this book, is that man is the animal. Okay, man is animal is man, etc. Man is an animal that forgot of its animality. It's an animal that separated itself from animality, that's dominated it because of a fear of death, because of this fear of the inability to reproduce. And kind of the core argument that Maurizi makes here, and the critical theorist, I guess, is what he's elaborating on, is that the resolution of that conflict comes with man essentially returning to the animal in a way that is not a primitivist notion. It's not to return to this kind of hunter-gatherer ideal, but it's to come back to nature in a cooperative and understanding, a mutually beneficial relationship that isn't exploitative, that obliterates the fundamentals of oppression that undergird it. But the thing is that that's what is argued in this book, is that what makes man different from animal is that it differentiates itself, because an animal can't do that. You know, it doesn't do that in the same way. It doesn't create its own history in the way that a human does. So to what extent are we saying, in the same way that the vanguard says we have to have this separated group, which will then lead the unable masses, right? A mass of people, a mass of labor, I should say, that can't guide itself, at least according to the Leninist theory that we've read so far. We're advocating for the same thing for animals. And I don't have a bow to put on that point. It was just a very weird parallel to me.
I have a song that I wrote where I specifically call for a vegan vanguard, largely because
that's sick as hell.
There is actually a really dope hardcore band called Vanguard. They're vegan communists. Shout out. But yeah, that's actually one of the contentions that I have with his argument against animal rights activism. I do think it needs to be reformed to be a more obviously political and have a more theory-driven attitude toward the way that we approach animal rights activism, specifically around anti-speciesist animal liberation. But I think the idea of having a vegan vanguard of folks that are well-versed in critical theory, well-versed in Marxism, well-versed in the kind of moral arguments of animal rights activism can put all of those things together and actually provide something to other human animals to help us recognize our contentious dominion over nature and the way that we exploit other animals.
Yeah.
Shout out to the vegan vanguard.
Shout out to the vegan vanguard, I guess, man. You know, your vanguard should also be vegan, maybe, is what we're saying here.
Fuck yeah, shit.
Okay. Anyway,
let's get into the text, because we have been talking a lot around the text. Let's actually pull some stuff from the text.
All right.
I would say on 31, something that really spoke to me, kind of in the middle of the page. Since animal exploitation underlies the economic structure of contemporary society, it is indeed presented and justified as natural from the cradle to the grave, thus determining the cultural horizon which shapes our conscience. And then he says also on 34, the dominion over nature has always been justified in the name of the spirit, but it is in fact grounded on domination inside society, on social hierarchy. What I think is important there is this point that he's bringing up that you already kind of alluded to earlier in the show, which is it's just kind of like we've spent so much of human history in this dominating attitude toward animals, in this attitude of speciesism toward animals, where human animals see themselves as superior to non-human animals in pretty much every way, and use that as a justification for the exploitation of them and the commodification of them. And that's, I think, an important point in showing how intertwined the attitudes of an anti-speciesist animal rights activism is connected to a Marxist attitude, which is like, you can't have human liberation without animal liberation, but you can't have animal liberation without human liberation. They are part and parcel because we are talking about two different forms of animalia.
Yeah. Just in a broad view, there's this really interesting pattern. You know what it reminds me of is those diagrams from Capital where it's like one thing expanding into two and coming back into one.
Yeah.
It's literally like nature here in the beginning, which is then split off by humanity, by necessity, whatever, into animal and human, right? And then those eventually what we're aiming for is for them to come back together. You know, the ultimate culmination of these developments is for them to be rejoined, I guess. Man, we are dialecticians at this point, aren't we?
That is a criticism that's often lobbed at animal rights activists that he does actually kind of mention a couple of times in this first part, which is the like kind of equating between human animals and non-human animals as moral creatures.
Yeah.
And that is something that sets a lot of people off, like they don't see any sort of moral equivalence between the two. And I agree with Maurizi that it's not wrong to identify and distinguish the traits that make human animals distinct from non-human animals. I think he would agree with me also that that does not negate the moral consideration that should be afforded to non-human animals. And so it's an interesting thing, like you're saying with that diagram, where we split and then come back together. That coming back together is not necessarily equating the two as moral creatures, just saying that they are both morally relevant.
Yeah. Well, I want to stay on this quote, though, before we get off of this, because I think that there's something in part 8 that I really enjoyed, and that he's talking about that magic, that mythos, right? And he's talking about religion in this sense, on a more broad scale, I suppose, right? He says, the autonomy of the spirit and its opposition to nature is only possible when some individuals live upon the work of others and can eventually dedicate themselves to spiritual activities. And I think that the way that he draws the development of, I'm just going to say religion as a broad category here, because I can't think of a better word, but it's interesting when in the development of societies, when we're talking about the more primitive societies, pre-Neolithic or whatever, it's not that they didn't have deities, right? It's not that they didn't have mystical relations with nature, but it's interesting to note that those were characterized by natural representations, right? By plants, by animals, by the earth itself.
Yeah.
You know, whereas when the development of history is separating our humanity further from the animal, we see a shift in those development of those religious icons to something more anthropocentric.
Yeah.
Anthropocentric. And I just think that that's a really interesting point because it's just a further elaboration of that idea of us getting away from nature. You know, our gods were before part of nature, now they're part of us. You know, that's part of our separation. And I just like that.
Yeah, very good point.
On the next page, though, when you were talking about the polar hunters or whatever, when he says, according to this theory, polar hunters and New York policemen should both adopt vegetarian diets and advocate for animal rights. He does literally the thing you were talking about. Yeah. Something to say about that is that we're still not talking about the development of history in concrete stages. Like, that's not what we're advocating for here. He says that it's a sliding transition, you know, between these societies, you know, pre-agricultural, agricultural, civilization, whatever. And so there is a way to think about, he says that those prehistoric tribes were closer to animal. And I don't think he means that in like a primitive savage type beat, right? I'm pretty sure I understand what he's saying there. You know, and it's interesting to think that societies that are still maintaining aspect of that tradition are literally closer to the animal relation in that sense. So when we're talking about changing people's actual modes of production, it's easier to justify leaving those, at least in a transitionary sense, because they are, in fact, closer to the ideal relation of man and animal than our society is. You know, and that's not to do some kind of noble savage, indigenous knowledge fucking type shit. It's just to say that in the development of society, the way we're talking about our modes of production, that process is still literally closer to the ideal than what we're talking about. It's closer to the animal ideal than our processes.
Yes, I think I agree with all of that.
Okay.
Approval granted.
Yes, thank you, vegan sire.
Okay, I have a few that all kind of go together.
Okay.
Starting on 53.
All right.
So there's something that he's building here that I think is a little bit contradictory. Surplus accumulation and the division of labor increase the exploitation rate of both humans and animals. It is only when someone can make profit out of them that animals become things and humans become slaves. So he's kind of talking about commodification there in a way that, like, it's only at the point where profit can be made off of literally the body of a human animal or a non-human animal that they become commodified. They become things or they become slaves. On 54, only if the economic necessity of exploitation is questioned can we think of a different social order where hierarchies based on class, sex, race, and species are smashed down. Hierarchies based on class, sex, race, and species are not issues we should discuss or moral advances we should demand. We must leave the heavens of moral abstraction and understand how the social machine actually works. All of those things separately, I think, are all true and all make sense. But when you put them together, I see a contradiction there. The idea that he's saying that this commodification of animals and humans as mechanisms for profit, essentially, he's calling that some sort of moral abstraction, even though there is very clearly a material reality where those things are happening. And to demand that things like class, sex, race, and species get smashed down is a necessity to see those forms of exploitation be smashed down as well. So we're not talking about it in an abstract moral sense, even though there is a moralism attached to the action that's happening there.
Yeah, I don't know. I read this in a way where I read it to mean he was saying almost like in an identitarian lens, you know, like it's not...
Maybe I'm misinterpreting it, especially the last bit there, but the idea that class, sex, race, and species are not issues we should discuss or moral advances we should demand. Yeah, because it's not merely an issue to talk about speciesism or sexism or classism or racism. There are implications that are much larger than that, which is the whole fucking point, which is why you should demand to see an end to those sorts of things. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Like, there is a material reality that's not some sort of moral abstraction. So, like, to demand the end of one is not living in the heavens of moral abstraction.
Yeah. Well,
it is understanding that social machine.
I think he's just talking about taking them as an independent issue. That's how I had read that, was that, you know, rather than looking at one thing specifically, it's much more important to look at the whole of it. Don't do it. Don't do it.
Yeah, I mean, I do agree that it's a mistake to say classism doesn't have racism or sexism implications, that classism doesn't have speciesism implications. Those things are all part of the larger kind of thing, which is, even though I decry it all of the time, why I do see the truth in, like, there's no war but class war, because class war encompasses all of these other forms of oppression.
Yes. What I was trying to think of was about the material base of it, right? Because that's what he's saying is the basis of these relationships is one of exploitation. Yeah, it's just to look at the whole thing. That's just how I read it. I don't know where I'm going with this.
Maybe I'm overly defensive, but I read that and I was like,
No, I think he was just saying that it all rolls together. You know, a rising tide lifts all ships.
I would agree with the interpretation that a struggle against racism only is living in the heavens of moral abstraction. A struggle against classism only is to live in the heavens of moral abstraction, because all of those things must be a part of all of the other ones.
Yes.
That was a terrible way to say that.
That's how I read it anyway.
Okay.
Anyway, I love the quote at the bottom. The human animal is the animal that should start a revolution and smash the cage of class and species oppression.
I was looking for that a minute ago because when you were talking about the vegan vanguard.
Yeah, the vegan vanguard. Yeah, smash the cage, you know?
Yeah.
All right.
I still got a few more.
Yes, by all means.
Okay, so to go to 58.
Okay.
On 57 and 58, he starts talking about direct action organizations, specifically naming ALF, the Animal Liberation Front, and is kind of decrying them as almost adventurism, I guess, suggesting that even if they are useful in a very isolated case, that action like that is never going to bring about the systematic change that is necessary. And I agree. Mm-hmm. On 58, he says, in a nutshell, destroying a single property because it breeds, exploits, and or kills animals does not in any way affect the property system, and therefore leaves undisturbed what makes property possible. And I get the point, but I would argue that fear of retribution does in fact change systems, even if you would make a Marxist argument that that change is reformative and not revolutionary. As a historical precedent, look at the crackdown in the United States on ELF, the Environmental Liberation Front, and ALF in the United States in the late 90s, early 2000s. They were deemed terrorists. Yeah. The term eco-terrorist was created by the FBI so they could use terrorism charges against Animal Liberation Front and Earth Liberation Front folks because they saw how dangerous it was to capital, how dangerous those actions were to the status quo. And they brought down the full repressive arm of the law against it. So while I agree that, like, individual action like that, like animal rescue that Alf still does, even though those individual things are not going to change the system as a whole, if enough of those things happened, there would be a significant fear on the part of the ruling class that could, in fact, inspire some change.
It's an interesting point because I was thinking about that in the broader context of the practical struggle. There is I don't want to say a dialectic because I'm not that confident. But there is a push and a pull between, for lack of better words, right, the capitalists and the revolutionaries, the capitalists and anti-capitalists, because they're changing each other, right, in that sense. And I don't know if I agree with saying that it would be reformative. I don't necessarily think that it's not on the same playing field in my mind, you know? And I don't know where that goes, but I think that, I totally agree with you. Because much in the same way, we should read How to Blow Up a Pipeline, because he makes that exact same argument. If we want change to happen, we need those people to change also, you know, and that is going to come from our action one way or the other. I think that action is more revolutionary than reform. Maybe back on that question from the last episode, you know.
That's exactly what I had in my mind.
Yeah.
And my argument is because you're operating outside of the law, it's inherently revolutionary, even if what it brings about is a change in the law. You know what I mean? That's where I think you could see an argument for it being reformative.
I don't know. I had like a gut reaction to like the illegalism there, but I don't know. But I agree with you. Yeah,
Shout
I don't
out Animal Liberation Front.
Hell yeah. Keep that shit up, brother. You know. Sorry. He quotes from, he does some interesting quoting here from Marx. This is actually from The Jewish Question, where he's talking about the basis of rights as a whole. And I think he makes an interesting point where he says to talk about rights is, you know, like what kind of rights will be afforded to us in this ideal society are different than the rights we're thinking of today. You know, the rights that we think of as universal today are stemming from history itself. I mean, they come from the Enlightenment. So to think of like rights as this universal idea is a little silly because it's completely abstracted from its actual social environment.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I'll just point out a couple of quotes that I think are good. We don't necessarily have to dive deep on them or anything like that. But at the bottom of 71 on to 72, in a liberated society, in fact, social and scientific progress would both work out the best way to establish an equal and just relationship between our kind and the non-human world. And he continues, our political model will be convincing precisely because it will unify interests that present society depicts as contradictory. And to kind of expand on that on 73 on to 74, a true anti-speciesist message should focus on the importance of developing a sensitivity for otherness in all its forms, including human alterity. It should stimulate our imagination, propel new social, intersubjective, and ultrasubjective relationships, define humanity in terms of humility rather than arrogance. And that's just more of him talking around this idea that human liberation and animal liberation are so entwined that it's really not possible to get one without the other.
Yeah.
To focus on one and ignore the other is ultimately to cut short or cut off at the knees the one that you are focusing on.
Yeah. In fact, something on 72 that speaks to that point, I think, the idea of looking at just the animal perspective, not the human perspective. I'm looking towards the bottom of 72 and he says, we talk about food, clothing, experimentation, circuses, and fairs, but we never talk about food, clothing, experimentation, circuses, and fairs, i.e., we talk about these as human activities, but only for their effects on the animals. Since animals are the center for our consideration, the context of their exploitation simply vanishes. Consequently, we never talk about what could really unify these protests and actually give them meaning and perspective, i.e., the implicit reference to a nonviolent and non-oppressive human society. So to focus simply on the animals themselves that are being exploited is to miss the point, is that we are exploiting these animals for a reason, for a societal purpose, right? It is to meet our needs. Whether those are true or false needs is not really part of the concern because it stems from the society that is built. It stems from the society that is present. We have to actually focus on both aspects of this equation in order to truly change it. We can't look at just the animals or just the activity.
Yeah, because animal exploitation in society is used to fulfill a need, but it is not the only thing that could fulfill that need.
Right.
And so if we focus only on animal liberation and somehow magically end all animal exploitation, that need that was previously filled by that animal exploitation will be filled elsewhere. And if we are not looking at the exploitative nature of the system that is pointing the gun at the animals in the first place, it's just going to point somewhere else.
Right.
I'd add that to my point that animal liberation without sweeping systemic change would still result in exploitation because the systems of exploitation would just redirect elsewhere. I'll stand by that point, but I would implore us not to let that invalidate the urgent necessity of adopting an anti-speciesist vegan politic as individuals. Back to the show!
And just to kind of further that, I'm looking at page 76 because he talks a little bit about lab-grown meat here. I'm interested in what he says at the bottom because he says, a world where the first cause of animal exploitation and death has been definitively banished would be a world where anthropocentrism has not been defeated. Veganism would probably end, while anti-speciesism would still have to take its major first steps. And I think that's kind of what I was getting at earlier when I was talking about the technological advancements and the ideal veganism, because there is a world possible where a fully plant-based life is possible in the sense that we're not exploiting animals. I mean, even lab-grown meat is not necessarily plant-based, but whatever. But it's not necessarily to say that that society is a liberatory one, right? One where animals are liberated. The relationships of human-animal oppression have been changed. I just think that that's an interesting point because that actually says to me more about the inadequacy of veganism.
Certainly, that's what the way he's framed this first part as the inadequacy of the animal rights movement in general.
Yeah. It's just that idea that there is a capitalist fulfillment of the vegan ideal possible. Shaky, but yeah. Not in the sense... See, the reason it's shaky is because I'm thinking about what you had said earlier. Where
the difference between plant-based and vegan.
Bingo, yeah, you got it. So yeah, I guess if your vegan ideal is about animal liberation, then no. But if you're talking about simply fulfilling all the needs that we have that currently are fulfilled by animals with something else, just changing those, not necessarily changing our relationship to animals in a sense of domination.
Yeah. Side note, though, this is exactly why a strong, clear theoretical framework needs to undergird the animal liberation movement, because this distinction between the language muddies the conversation even among people that are trying to do something to fight against the exploitation of animals. You know what I mean?
It could be totally vegan washed if you don't have that.
Vegan washed.
You know, I just right off the dome.
I only have a couple more things for part one.
Okay.
One quick thing to address on 78. He gives us this quote here near the top. We find ourselves in the same position as Catholics who try to convince atheists that the embryo is a moral subject. Back to the point that I just made about a clear theoretical framework. I think that this is a very good analogy, and it is one that non-vegans use all the time to try to attack vegans, and they say something like, you can't be vegan and pro-choice at the same time, because they have a complete misunderstanding of what personhood is. This is why a clear, concise definition of personhood is necessary, because a definition of personhood, which is philosophically means someone worthy of moral consideration, clears the air, clears the distinction between how one can be vegan and pro-choice, how one should be vegan and pro-choice, and it still is ideologically consistent.
The pro-life argument reminds me of a primitivist argument, like that we should return to this traditional sense of childbirth. I mean, you know what I mean?
Bonkers.
Yeah, you know, it's just that, like, what are you talking about, dude?
Bite this stick.
We've already done so much to effectively change the way that, well, I don't want to get into that, but yeah, you know what I mean. Yeah, it just reminds me of the primitivist argument.
Okay, last two things all come from 81 and 82.
Okay.
He who indicates a problem is not responsible for the problem itself. The fact that society is not an aggregate of individuals and that its transformation cannot be the result of the mechanical conversion of individuals to veganism does not mean that veganism is wrong or that it should be abandoned. It rather means that it is insufficient and that whenever we are talking of a social change, it is totally irrelevant. The aim of my criticism is to complete veganism with social action as political struggle. Chef's kiss. Completely agree.
Bellissimo.
Love it. And I think that the personal is political, but it is insufficient as praxis. Like a collective social politic is necessary because, as I'd mentioned before, we have collectively built, through history, not you and I as individuals, but we have collectively through history built these systems of oppression, and it will take a collective dismantling. Individual action isn't going to do anything to dismantle those systems of oppression. Yeah, I know I'm the worst, but for clarity, I believe an individual decision for veganism is still necessary as a reasonable response to the urgent issue of animal exploitation. We shouldn't willfully participate in systems of exploitation that are avoidable. Back to the show. I would close with a quote from 82. The aim of the animal liberation struggle is therefore not to veganize the world, but to introduce a different mode of production that takes into account the needs of all human and non-human subjects involved, and that therefore will abolish animal exploitation in all its forms.
Hell yes, dude.
So, full disclosure, I read the introduction to this and I was like, dope, sounds like he's going to lob some legitimate criticisms toward the animal rights activist movement, and then move on to why Marxism demands a vegan attitude in its politic. And as I was getting partway through part one, I was like, man, he's really fucking laying into these criticisms of animal rights activists.
Yep.
And I was starting to feel a little uncomfortable. Not because I think they're illegitimate. Nearly every criticism that he lobs is legitimate. And I wish that more vegans were true anti-speciesist animal liberationists. And I know that that's just not the case. I've met a lot of vegans that do not extend their attitude of veganism into the political sphere in any other way. And so they're not truly vegan in my attitude. You know what I mean? Again, not to be like, yeah. But I don't know. I was a little uncomfortable reading the first part. I was really looking forward to getting into part two because I wanted to see, put to words, all of these feelings that I do not feel equipped in my understanding of Marxism to truly put together. But I have felt for a very long time that there is a very clear connection between animal liberation and proletarian liberation.
Sure.
Did part two do that?
See, it's interesting because I think that I really enjoyed this, I will say. And I think it's because I'm appreciative of his willingness to criticize Marx and Engels, to say, here's where they were clearly blinded to these things, and I like that. I don't know necessarily how I feel about his attempt to fill the gaps, though, and it's mostly because I still don't know how I feel about the critical theorists, you know what I mean? There's so much of their argument on a philosophical level that I can agree with, and I don't understand its implementation, you know? And I know that they would probably say, not to put words in their mouth, but they'd probably say, like, to contemplate that is the first step. But it's really tricky for me to read all of this kind of, like, you know, talking about the negation and the other and a lot of that stuff, and then to try to put it into a practical term. And that's more of a part 3 thing anyway, when he starts talking about praxis. But it's just something that is on my mind as I'm reading through this, because I can absolutely agree with the critical theorists when they're talking about the necessity to look at these forms of domination at the root, because if not, we won't get rid of these systems but perpetuate them.
Yeah.
And I'm pretty hip to that. Like, that resonates with me. There's a footnote in the end where they start talking about the praxis of not doing, you know? And I'm like, what the fuck are you talking about?
Yeah.
You know? I'm not advocating for, like, do somethingism or whatever, but it's just about in what ways are these steps actually going to be put into action? And I know to ask that question is kind of to defeat the purpose that they're aiming at, but man, is it unsatisfying sometimes to read.
Yeah, I agree with that. I will say part 2 and part 3 kind of work in tandem in this way, but I went into part 2 really hopeful to see a clear extension of Marx and Engels' political analysis that leads to animal liberation. And he spends most of part 2, I would argue, saying it's not inconsistent with Marx and Engels, and kind of gives some concessions to Marx and Engels as, like, everyone that's saying that it is against it is reading them wrong kind of thing. But most of his argument hinges on the critical theorists, which comes more in part 3 than, or at least late in part 2, I guess. And so I was a little disappointed by that.
You know what it made me think of, man, is that it's another fucking dialectic. You know, we've split it off. He's convincing animal liberationists to work with Marxists, and then now he's saying animal liberation is completely compatible with Marxism.
Yeah.
You know, you might have these kind of foundational Marxist arguments that say to the other, basing that on Marx and Engels specifically, but here I, Maurizi, want to say, actually, no. And so I can kind of see that. And then to see those split off and then come together in the third part again, you know, just interesting. He's clearly a fan of his own fucking philosophy, that's for sure.
Yeah, so I don't know. I mean, I have some stuff to say about part 2. He opens with what I think is a pretty good summation of what would be his thesis for part 2 on 87. Marxism is not incompatible with animal liberation. By including the struggle against animal oppression in its theoretical framework, Marxism achieves a higher, more consistent materialist point of view.
Yeah.
So I agree. And again, when I read that, I was like, ooh, boy, here we go.
Yeah.
This is the thing. Because I have long felt, in my own limited understanding of animal liberation and of Marxism, I'm an idiot. In my limited understanding, I see them as very closely parallel and really struggles against different forms of the same oppressions. And so I was really excited to read that. But I will say, as I went through with part 2, I didn't really feel satisfied with it in that regard, partly because it's so challenging. If anything, reading this made me feel like I don't know shit about Marxism and dialectical materialism.
Yeah.
Because it was so challenging to even just get through the technical side of what he's arguing, right?
Yeah.
But I also feel like maybe it's because he gets so mired in his own intellectualism that it doesn't clearly articulate the connections between Marxism and animal liberation that I see so clearly. Things like commodification and alienation, things like exploitation of labor, which I'm sure we'll touch on, the do animals labor thing. The working conditions in the animal exploitation industry. Like, these are things that to me are very clear delineations that a Marxist should take umbrage with and should lead a pretty clear path toward veganism as a means of animal liberation. But he does not spell it out clearly. And if anything, I think he is very generous to Marx and Engels as opposed to like being as critical as I think he should be.
Okay. I think, something about being mired in intellectualism is kind of probably appropriate here, because it seems that he's dealing so much with the general form of the relationship. He's not wasting any time on the specifics. And wasting is not the right word there, because the devil's in the details. Even when he's talking about creating this world from the bottom up, that's the kind of thing we're talking about. The theory comes from top down, the praxis comes from bottom up. And so much of that bottom-up focus is missing here because he's talking about at the top of the pyramid relationship between animals and humans. So, I agree with you. It's a little intellectualized. And I was like not having a superb time trying to figure this out. But it's not that that's the thing, is it's just like, it feels like learning another fucking language. Like, I'm getting in the habit of using these ideas because I think some of these concepts are so simple at first. The face value, at least, is simple. Like, to understand what it means for something to be the negation is easy. But when you start to put it into actual use in this kind of argumentation, then it gets a lot more complex. And I think so much of that is that you really have to sit down and think about these things. And the problem is that it's all about the thinking. It's not about any of the doing. Because the doing has to do with, again, those actual processes, like we were saying earlier, like almost like when we were talking about the focus on the animal versus the focus on the needs that those animals are meeting, right? It's the same thing here. We're thinking about the relationship rather than the actual processes that are establishing this relationship.
Yeah.
But again, just to kind of go back in his favor, it's that you can't have one without the other. We have to do both.
Yeah. Okay. Something you just said made me think about, back to the point that I had alluded to earlier in the episode about value judgments in Marxism. I think this kind of cold, mechanical, intellectualized attitude toward issues like this, while I can understand and appreciate its merit, I think that value judgments are needed in Marxism, largely because I would argue the suggestion that folks don't find Marxism as a political and economic ideology as an extension of some moral attitude, empathy, justice, a bulwark against exploitation, whatever. I think that dismissal is reductive and over-intellectualizes something that's really simple. Communism is appealing, to some at least, because it offers our best chance at things like democracy, justice, equity. These are things that are not means, they are an ends.
Yeah.
But to argue that those things are not valuable and would not be meaningful as a part of our conversation with developing class consciousness and moving people in a direction of actually achieving something materially, as opposed to just presuming that it's in a fatalistic way that it's not possible or something like that. I think that that's really important. I think that aseptic attitude is alienating to the movement. It really hinders growth. I have 2 quotes from Engels that Maurizi calls out here.
Yahoo!
This is from Anti-During. We therefore reject every attempt to impose on us any moral dogma whatsoever as an eternal, ultimate, and forever immutable ethical law on the pretext that the moral world, too, has its permanent principles which stand above history and the differences between nations. Now, I think some people might read that as an idea that Marxism is not moral, that it's an amoral political doctrine, but I would disagree. I think it should be noted that this doesn't mean moralism needs to be excluded. It just means that it is not immutable and unchanging. And I think part of what Maurizi is bringing up, and I wish he would lean into a little bit more, is that Marx and Engels are not outside of the kind of morality of their time. Where they fall short in extending the theory directly to animal liberation, I think, and he kind of alludes to it, but I think is an extension of the attitude around animals around them.
I totally agree. I absolutely agree with you there, especially when he talks about Engels' criticism of vegetarianism and anti-vivisectionism as being against scientific socialism is because they're literally operating in this super rational time, you know? To go back to what you were saying about morals, though, I think that it's interesting. Something you said about them being immutable is really the key here. It's not to hand wave away the pursuit of these moral ideas, justice, equality, etc. It's that the pursuit of them changes the ideals themselves. You know, the society that we are looking to create in this pursuit of liberation comes with it a different set of rights, just as he was saying earlier in the book. To say, like, these are the ends that we must have, justice, equality, in these current era definitions, right, fundamentally comes from the Enlightenment, not anything, not anything intrinsic to human development, to nature even, necessarily. To say that those are the ends that we must struggle for, I think is to miss the point, because those ends are to be changed also.
Certainly, yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, maybe I shouldn't have called it an ends. I guess the point I was trying to make, though, was that...
If I may, that's kind of where the critical theorists come in and fill the gaps, because they're more willing to accept a relationship between the ideal and the physical. You know, they're more willing to say that culture has its own reflection upon the physical creation of society. It's just that the process is changing. I don't think that it's dismissive of those moral attitudes. I think it's more inclusive of them than that. Because it's saying that the creation of these ideals have allowed us to think of a society in which those ideals are the means. I'm sorry,
are possible.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Right? It's just that whatever society we have that will fulfill those needs will be so changed that, I'm not saying that liberty, equality, justice, etc. won't still exist, right? I'm just talking about the fact that the way that those rights are expressed societally will be different because our society will be different.
Yeah. And I agree that it's not immutable. The idea of justice is not something that is so fixed that in 100 years after revolution has started and society has been completely reformed or something like that, that in 100 years our definition of justice must be exactly the same. The hope, the goal would be that society changes in such a way that our definition of justice along with it must also change.
Yeah.
I think that that's good. I think a dismissal of the idea at all is bad.
I think that's why he brings in the critical theorist there, is because that whereas, Marx and Engels might have been operating in that contemporary rationality, it's a development, it's a transcendence of their belief, perhaps. Like, we're still incorporating those ideas. It's just the fact that morals do have a place in it. It's just that in the way I think that we concretely try to talk about them, maybe they're over-concretized. That might be the best way to put it.
Yeah, I don't know. There's something uncomfortable when we talk about things like child labor or chattel slavery or something like that. Things that there is a clear way for a Marxist to be uncomfortable with the manifestations of those things that doesn't have to do with moralism. But the most obvious thing is that it is a moral affront to do those things.
Sure.
You know what I mean? Yeah. And so to dismiss that as a means of organization, as a means of mobilization, as a means of beginning an education, I think is foolhardy. And I wish when I get on TikTok talking about veganism and Marxism that the argument wasn't Marxism is an amoral attitude, It's like, but why though?
Yeah.
Why must it be? Because I have a quote. Maurizi says, ethics would rather be the goal of a liberated society than one of its premises. And yes, I agree, but ethics are normative. That means that they're manifested in action, so that means it's based on a premise. This is too dismissive of ethical consideration when developing our society. Instead of depending on some sort of amoral formation ultimately manifesting an ethical ends, we have a premise of what that ethics should look like, and we build toward that and continue to change our definition of it as we are developing that society. Because our biases and our habits shape our behavior. Marx and Engels were not vegans, so obviously they have I would argue Marx does have a pretty speciesist bias, even though Maurizi gives him a pretty big hand wave.
Sure.
That bias is inherently carried in his attitude, whether he likes to say that it isn't or not.
Yeah.
That's the way biases work.
Sure.
We all carry them.
Yeah, I think that's totally reasonable. It's interesting to explore that kind of contradiction, because on one hand, we talk about all the ways that Engels was, anti-vegetarian, anti-vivisection, and all of that stuff, but at the same...
He was a cannibalism apologist also. I'm sorry, I keep interrupting your thoughts.
Many anthropologists would also agree, I think. Anyway, the quote is in the same book. Not only is he the man that said that was anti-scientific progress, but he was also the man that said our domination of nature is a complete issue, and soon we will pay the price.
Yeah.
I agree with you. I think there is a place for morals there. I don't know, actually. It's not that I don't know about that. I'm pretty sure I agree with you. But they're men, after all. That's all I can say.
I'm so glad that someone else will say that. Like, not to pretend that I'm like some paragon
a Marx
of...
understander.
Exactly. But like, so many people are so dogmatic about Marx. Dude was just a dude.
Just a guy.
He clearly understood quite a few things. But to pretend as though his conception of things, like the human-animal dynamic, was not shaped by the time and place in which he lived is foolhardy. It's stupid. And I appreciate, even though I don't think Maurizi takes it far enough, that he says there is an extension here that Marx and Engels are missing, and continues to elaborate on it.
Word. That's what I was saying earlier. I'm appreciative of his willingness to say that there are gaps here in the Marxist dogma, and there has been some elaboration on it, believe it or not. Unfortunately, it comes in the form of incredibly dense German philosophy. If you're a critical theorist listening to this because you're one of 10 people that fucking look for this shit online, email us at leftandredfeedback@gmail.com and let us know.
I would like to just point out on 92 that from the Dialectics of Nature, which was recommended to us by a listener, I'm sure we'll get to that eventually, but Maurizi quotes, "In the Dialectics of Nature, Engels clearly states that all human qualities can be found in other animals, self-consciousness, language, intelligence, teleology, etc." And I would just like to point out that that is not unlike the arguments that you hear animal rights activists make about morally relevant differences and what we call sentience between humans and non-human animals. So shout out to Engels for recognizing that.
Totally. With each subsequent study, we find out how more and more intelligent animals are, When we read Mutual Aid, Kropotkin was saying the same shit, and it was in fucking 1885 or whatever, So
we skipped talking about the intro also, but a good chunk of the intro is Maurizi shitting on Bentham and pointing out how Marx is shitting on Bentham. And I don't get it. I'm not like the biggest Bentham lover in the world or anything like that, but...
You Bentham lover.
But like there is something to Bentham's kind of the simplicity to his utilitarianism that does speak to me. Like his question on the animal question in fucking 18 whatever the fuck when Bentham was alive was like, do they suffer? Do they feel pain? And the answer is clearly yes. So why should we put them through it? And I appreciate that.
Did we talk about there is a material argument for those kinds of things as well, even in the narrow aspect of like what you're eating, I'm thinking about halal food, right? Part of the halal regulation is that you can't kill an animal in front of another animal. Mm-hmm. And it's because they feel that stress, and the stress literally makes the meat taste worse, So like there are material arguments for that kind of kindness within all of this. I just think it's crazy that we have I don't know. I mean, our relationship to food is so fucked, man. It's so fucked beyond belief. Yeah. Thinking about unfucking it is like impossible. It's thought ending because I'm like, it's too great a problem, Obviously not, but it is a sincere issue.
Yep. I would jump forward to page 130 because I think these two quotes go together, actually form a stronger thesis than the one that he opens the section with. The problem with Marxism is not that humans are granted some species' privilege over animals, but that our becoming human in communist society, our overcoming of the natural struggle for existence, does not imply the end of animal exploitation. Yet, there is no reason to deny the plausibility of this expansion. On the contrary, everything seems to push in that direction. If human slavery can be considered an inevitable transition in the construction of a free and equal society, the same could be said of animal slavery. In this perspective, we would be animals that learn to put an end to their hostility against the other animals. And I agree, it is not only that Marxism has an allowance for animal liberation, an anti-speciesist animal liberation, but in fact, it is a natural extension of the tenets of Marxism.
Yeah. I mean, not to get you in hot water with undue parallels again, but like if what I was thinking about earlier when I was reading this is that it's that our struggle is not a struggle for the betterment of humanity. It is a struggle for the eradication of exploitation. And with it comes the betterment of humanity. It's not that our goal is to uplift humanity to some transcendent, whatever stage. It is a goal, but it's not the goal, The The goal is to get rid of the oppression. The goal is to create society. I love the way he says it in here, is that communism is and can only be the social form where the potential freedom of capitalism is fully accomplished for each and all, right? That freedom is freedom from exploitation. The capitalist mode of production accomplishes that for a select few, right? Those people, the capitalists, the 1%, the bourgeois, whatever, those people have freedom from exploitation because they are forced to exploit others. We want that same kind of freedom of exploitation for all subjects of society, okay? And if you take that to the broadest extent, that means animals too. It's not that we're saying that any other struggle is more or less important. We're saying that the struggle is important. The struggle against oppression, the struggle against exploitation. That's what matters. It's not about any particular group of people. It's about taking the society which is built on exploitation and getting rid of the exploitation.
Beautiful.
Sorry to be so impassioned.
That was great. I agree with that entirely.
And it kind of reminds me of, honestly, the reformist argument. It's like we're not just looking to change the players of the game. You know, we're looking to change the game.
Yeah.
It's to accept the rules of the game, but to know that they can be changed. That's a great quote from here, and I don't remember who said it. Someone, and that's a banger. We accept the rules of the game, but they can be changed. On 175, a mankind which no longer knows want will begin to have an inkling of the delusory feudal nature of all arrangements hitherto made in order to escape want, which used wealth to reproduce it. Rien faire comme une bête, to do nothing, like an animal. Beautiful. That is what I would like, actually. You know, ignorance is bliss. I'd like to be ignorant like an animal, please.
You see TikToks and shit all the time about like the lives that a cat lives or something like that. And it's just fucking napping, eating, and fucking
having a ball.
You know what I mean? And we look at that with admiration because it is a life that is unfettered by all of the fucking weight that is put on us under the system.
You know, and I think the cat's a great example, too, because we allow them such a freedom that they think they're the boss. You know what I mean? Like, they're fulfilled. You know, I know that there's obviously levels to...
There's a dynamic.
Yes, thank you. But the grace that we allow cats is because they are free from exploitation in that sense. Mm-hmm. You know, that kind of air of superiority that we lend to them, regardless of whether it's true or not, is because they're literally free from our conditions, you know? Their refusal to be trained, you know, is another expression of that too. We say like, oh, cats can't be trained. We don't impose on them the same kind of maybe exploitation in that same way, oppression, whatever. I just think that was interesting.
Okay, on 154, to close part 2, all those Marxists who do not see the inherently idealist, spiritualist structure of dominion remain comfortably seated in the cathedral, calling back to an analogy or a metaphor that he used at the start of the chapter. They never plan to descend into the depths of the animal horror, hence the narrowness and contradiction of their materialistic point of view, a unilateral vision that does not investigate the genesis of the alterity between human and non-human animals, but only asserts it as an undisputed fact. I just wrote, boom, so well said.
I'm just thinking about the inception of history, capital H. It's like waking up, you know, like that moment must have been so fucking scary. To realize oneself. Babies do that. When kids realize their selfness, their ownness, it's a terrifying moment for them. I'll come back to that later, but when he says it's hard to put one's finger on the point where everything went wrong, I really love that, you know. I'd be amiss if I didn't mention David Graeber again. If you are more interested in that, listener, I'm talking to you too. If you're more interested in that moment where everything went wrong, you should absolutely check out David Graeber's and David Wengrow, Dawn of Everything. I'll pitch it many times, okay? It's too long for us to read, okay? I think it would be a horrid and fraught discussion, but if that idea, the moment in which humanity separated itself from animality, that's a fantastic book to read. I'll leave it at that. Part 3?
Yes, let's jump into part 3. I guess I've kind of established this motif of starting with what I think is the thesis of the section. This one is a couple of pages in, but I think he does give us a pretty good quote that I think summarizes the section pretty well. If the bourgeois ideologist fails to see that the destructiveness of capitalism is the product of class domination, speciesist Marxism cannot see that the destructiveness of civilization is the product of domination over nature. Capitalism can be disclosed as a universal catastrophe only if we criticize the blind necessity that keeps humans and animals under the same yoke in a complex and stratifies power structure that envelops and disfigures them both. Back to the point that you stated not long ago, like, it's not this manifestation of exploitation, it is exploitation. That is the thing.
Yeah.
And humans and animals just happen to fall under the yoke of that exploitation. Yeah. Because it is the overarching, all-encompassing form.
Yeah, right.
I'm realizing, I guess maybe that quote doesn't make a lot of sense out of context as a thesis for this section, because it sounds very much like what we were just talking about. But he elaborates in that same section on 170. He says, it is from this radical point of view in which the abolition of human and animal exploitation is one and the same, that we not only change history as we know it, i.e. the global meaning of history as class and species oppression, but at the same time produce new historical possibilities. That is how we are going to move beyond nature, so to speak.
Yeah. How do we do it, though? Well, you just got to think it. Think yourself rich.
I guess I would go backwards a couple of pages. We already kind of talked about technology, but I do think he brings up a couple of good points here. Technology is intertwined with social and historical progress. It expresses, so to speak, the law of transformation of social energy. Technology knows no intention and no favorite victims. It can both oppress and liberate humans and animals.
Yeah. I love it even further down when he says there's no general interest in humanity behind the historical development of technology.
Yep.
You know, and I think that there's something really to that because, again, I'm thinking about true and false needs, which isn't something that we've specifically read about, but there are true needs that technology is developed for. I'm thinking primarily of physiological needs, you know, hunger. Mm-hmm. That's the main one. False needs are created by your society. You know, they're needs that you have, wants that you have because of the society around you.
Yeah.
You know, to say that, you know, technology is always invented because of innovation. People need to make things because they need things. And it's like, yeah, I agree with you there. But to what extent are those needs a reflection of the society around it is the bigger question. Mm-hmm. You know, and I think that's the important thing about technology because it is a tool. It is a tool. It's an instrument. It's not directional in any way. It's just the fact that the needs that we're fulfilling by the development of this technology is developed by society. Our current technology is developed by class society.
Yep.
You know, and I think even to expand that point, he talks about that when it comes to our basis of knowledge, you know, our entire scientific foundation. Yeah, it says exactly what I just said there. We cannot lay claim a priori to any distinction between good and bad, genuine and created, right and wrong needs. However, it must also recognize that existing needs are themselves in their present form produced by class society. No neat distinction can be made between a need proper to humanity and one that would be a consequence of repression.
Yeah.
Needs can only be modified by praxis. So that's not the quote I wanted at all, because I was looking for one about science.
Look on 189.
Yeah, I love that one there where he says, every scientist who acts as if nature were brute matter in his hands is secretly a priest.
I have that for the cavalcade.
That's a fucking fantastic quote. Because it's a slap in the face to all of those people, man. Because I have a buddy who's exactly like that. We talk a lot about medical testing, especially he's in the medical field. There's times where he's like, it's an ends means thinking, right? The ends justify the means. Mm-hmm. And there's always a discomfort I have with that, you know, because he's always saying like the polio vaccine. He said it couldn't be released today under our regulations. And my counterpoint there is that if there was a need for a polio vaccine, then it would happen in the same way, regardless of the regulations around it. It's concerning to me because so many people hold that view of technology, especially people in the science and engineering fields, because I just think they have a very mechanical view. I don't know.
There's like a distance.
Yeah, it's that means ends rationality again. And that's really concerning to me.
Yeah, I agree. Technology is a tool, and tools are made to be wielded by the people, so it will therefore be used as an extension of the will and intention of the people, whether that be to oppress or to liberate. I tried to make a similar point in the anarchism episode about like a rifle. A rifle is not inherently oppressive, nor is it inherently liberatory. It's a tool, and you can use it for either one. It is a manifestation of the will of the wielder. And I think technology works in the same way. Maurizi says on 189, a liberated society would not really be free if science and technology were not finally freed from the profit which turns them into instruments of oppression and reification. Also, those who accepted nature as a moral standard, the social Darwinists, have set up extermination camps, killed the old and the disabled, sterilized defenseless people, used humans in horrific experiments. Like, these are things that will be wielded either to liberate or to oppress.
Yeah, I love on way early. It's on page 63. Yeah, at the bottom. These angry ideologies could not see that these aims were mere stepping stones to universal happiness. In America, human rights and democracy now have become the vision. Yes, he admits, there are still some huge problems with democracy, but we luckily got rid of that equality and class nonsense.
Yeah.
It's Ryder.
Ryder.
I don't know who that is.
I don't know. Yeah, I actually wrote lull right next to the next line, because one may suggest that there is a connection between the international defeat of the working class and the growth of the alt-right movement. But why spoil Ryder's quasi-religious certitude?
Yeah, absolutely great. Yeah, man. All the former East German places all voted for AfD. What can I say? Curious how that happens.
Curious. I have one more quote that I wanted to read from this section, and it happens to be on 188. Happens to be because I was already open on that page. That made no sense to anybody else but me. To think of achieving an egalitarian society without putting an end to the extermination of other living species through a hyper-productivist, expansive, selfish, violent, and dominating mode of production is a contradiction in terms. Agreed.
Yeah, totally.
I have kind of a personal beef with one particular issue, and it's about animals as subject.
Okay.
So I collected a shit ton of quotes about that.
Okay.
Should I string them together as like a point for the cavalcade real quick? Or should I just not do it at all?
I don't know what the content of the argument is. What are we talking about here?
It's because of my a TikTok that I posted about veganism and Marxism, and somebody was like, well, Marx doesn't regard animals as subject. And I was like, that's stupid. That's dogmatic. Why not? And the guy would never respond. He just deflected to other things.
Yeah.
And I've had it as a chip on my shoulder ever since to point out, like, why animals in nature should be subject.
What does that mean?
That's a fair question.
Should be subject? I'm not sure.
Should be considered a subject.
What does that mean too?
Yeah, so let me just rattle off some shit here.
Hit me.
Animals in nature should be subjects under Marxism. Here are some quotes. 151. Marx and Engels' unshakable belief in the goodness and rationality of such domination reveals an inability to conceive a limit in our appropriation of nature, a limit that would have forced them to accord nature the status of the subject. On 152, that is developed further. In the sense of an absolute subject which mediates itself with itself, but rather in the sense of an encounter between individuals, this is possible only by giving back animals their repressed subjectivity, recognizing them as alter egos of the human subject. Critical theory believes that Marx's refusal to acknowledge the subjectivity of nature as a limit to human expansionism produced a flaw in his materialist vision. Animals are subjects. Nature is subject. What does subjectivity even mean in this context? I do not think it is relevant to this conversation whatsoever, but for me, the idea of subjectivity means that one has moral relevance, because I'm thinking of it from the abstract moralism of a vegan, but the idea that one has relevance and has self-guided ability to live their life.
Yeah,
right?
like the self-determinative ability of an animal.
Of a subject.
Yes.
Which includes animals.
Yes, you're right. Oh, my apologies.
This is I'm going to cut all this.
No,
this is so stupid.
I don't think it's stupid. It's stupid because it sounds crazy. It's what I was saying earlier about the definition of this word is simple, but putting it into context makes it very complex.
Yes.
That's been my question too. Can animals self-determine? I mean, the answer is yes. They could go on and fulfill their lives with their own processes, right, in relation to nature. Mm-hmm. In that sense, yes, they can be autonomous and self-determinative, right? But are we talking about that in the same way that we consider human self-determination, right? Even from the lens of this book, if we're talking about the human subjectiveness as their ability to make history, which separates them from the animal can't do that. Or at least that's the argument here, is that we don't know an animal that can do that. Human is the animal that can do that. So I guess in that sense, animals are subject because humans are subject and humans are animals, right? Mm-hmm. That's been my issue with, like, do animals labor, right? In that sense, because what do they do with it? Survive. They could live an autonomous and self-determinative life.
We've fallen into something of a pit around this question about do animals labor when we've talked about veganism in the past. And I do think it's an interesting question worth examining. I don't personally put a lot of stock in it around the concept of animal liberation, but it was something that I had my eye out for in this text while we were reading. And it becomes quite clear that according to Marx and Engels, animals do not labor. And the argument from Marx is effectively that argument that we read in Capital, that the human conceptualizes their work before they make it. There's an imaginary making before the actual making. And so the labor manifests itself because it is a manifestation of that imagination. I would argue that that's a species' attitude, by the way, just to throw that out there. Beavers certainly conceptualize the dam that they're building before they build it. There is also a social relation among animals that I think has an important component to the question, do they labor? In that, like, we know that animal societies operate in a particular way where there is a division of labor that happens. So I lost my train of thought here. I did have some stuff for that question, do animals labor? Do you want to look at something from the book here about that?
Sure.
It's come up for us a couple of times, and we didn't settle on an answer. There was not something that the two of us felt comfortable, like, accepting, and it was just like, I don't know.
Yeah, who knows?
We'll figure it out.
Yeah.
While we were reading Capital, it came up again, and Maurizi makes it quite clear that Marx's definition of labor does not encapsulate animals. Yeah, and the quote that we get there, to Marx, the problem is not the expenditure of a certain quantity of muscles, nerves, and brain, which is the way Rosa Luxemburg defined labor. It is not the generic production of use values. It is clear that animals are able to produce use value. The problem is rather this: what is the source of the valorization of capital? If one does not distinguish human labor under capitalism from animal labor, one fails to understand the specificity of the capitalist mode of production. So according to Marx, animals wouldn't labor because they are not participating in the valorization of capital.
Yes. They don't perform capitalist labor, at least.
Yeah. The labor that they do, even though it is the expenditure of a certain quantity of muscles, nerves, and brain, which is the way I was effectively defining labor when we talked about it previously. I was like, do you sweat? Then it's labor. Not according to Marx. Maurizi, I think, takes a pretty similar view. I think he would also argue that that is a distinguishing factor between animals, non-human animals, and human animals. And the quote there is at the top of 112. Maurizi says, it would be completely misleading to identify human and animal labor. Of course, both human and animals work, and both work for the capitalist, yet there is a specific trait of human labor, a very specific position of the worker in their relation to the capitalist that animals do not have. A different understanding of the role played by workers and animals inside the capitalist machine is not a consequence of a species' prejudice. It is the very structure of the capitalist mode of production which creates such distinction of roles and functions. Okay.
What I'm trying to think about is the relationship of slavery to capitalism. Because if we were going to make an analog between animal labor and human labor, then if we're thinking about capitalist production, then I understand that distinction, because we're talking about labor as, like, there's no choice but to sell it on the market. You know, that the labor market is a condition of capitalist production, whereas animal labor isn't sold on a market in that same way. They're literally enslaved. I'm curious to explore more on that, I think, because I think that this is still an unresolved question for me, unfortunately. But I think that slavery is probably the closest human analog that we would have to animal labor if we wanted to make an actual comparison.
I would agree with that wholeheartedly.
Yeah.
But yes, I think the mode of exploitation of animals under capitalism now is most analogous to human chattel slavery. And so I do not ever raise the question, did slaves labor, as a relevant part of the conversation, in the same way that I don't know that how much stock I put into the do animals labor question. Yeah. Not because I think it's invalid, just because it doesn't factor into my attitude toward my political veganism.
Well, I think that in a way it does. I mean, that's the thing, is that it's hard to see where animal labor fits into the critique of capital that Marx is putting forth, because he's so specifically focused on human labor under the capitalist mode of production.
Yeah.
I don't know. I'm interested, though. It's a bit of an open door for me, I think.
You raise an interesting point about animals' inability to enter into, like, the MCM mode. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Like, human animals are forced into that under fear of starvation. You know what I mean? Animals are not forced into that. They are captured and enslaved and bred into an exploitative context, an exploitative situation, but they are not entering into the labor market. So there's an interesting question there. That's a wrinkle I hadn't really considered before we read Capital.
Well, it's just because I had the thought that Marx was focused specifically on the capitalist mode of production. That's why he completely discounts animal labor. But the inverse of that is that I don't know what his consideration of animal labor would be operating outside of the capitalist mode of production or within it.
Yeah.
You know?
I guess my previous dismissal of it as a question worth exploring was mostly around technology. Like, when I think of the question, do animals labor, I'm thinking of an agrarian society, like, did the ox pulling the plow labor?
Yeah.
Well, certainly, but technology has replaced that labor now, so why does it matter? You know what I mean? Not to say that there aren't certainly still beasts of burden being used in particular ways, but just in that, like, it didn't seem like a question that factored into my consideration in modernity.
Yeah.
I don't know how to say it without sounding like an asshole.
No, I think that I think we're on the path to resolution here. I just don't think it's going to happen today. Maybe we're talking about distinct modes of production, I guess. And I don't know the transition. I don't know what it looks like.
Yeah. When we were reading Capital, and I didn't bring any of it up on the episode because I was like, this is a conversation for another day, but reading chapter 5, and specifically when Marx is making clear delineations between human and animal work, one of which is labor and one of which is not, according to Marx, I was just like rattling off examples where I'm like, but this is contradictory. Like I said, a beaver definitely conceives of the dam before they build it. The bees are definitely working in tandem to suit, under a division of labor, a particular need. We had a listener write in that brought up another really good example with crows leading wolves to kill, to food, essentially. Yeah. It being a division of labor that works inside of Animalia. Yeah. And I was like, so who cares?
What's so weird to me, though, is that I guess it's a question of thinking. I guess it's a question of planning. You know, this is just me sincerely not knowing, like, to what extent a bee, for example, a bee constructs a nest based on what? Is it plans? Is it instinct? To what extent is instinct a plan? I guess is really my thing, because instinct carries with it an unthinking notion, you know, whereas we're talking about planning, meaning like an actual, like you complete the idea in your head, whereas a bee isn't drawing out a beehive and then constructing the whole beehive. They're globbing on, you know, wax in whatever form that they're programmed to do, essentially. And I don't care for programmed there, but you know what I mean.
I know what you mean.
Yeah. You know, and then the end result of that is a beehive. It's not that they're building a beehive from the outside in. They're building it literally from the bottom up based on their instinct. I don't know.
Yeah, I think that just opens another door to a wider, more complicated conversation that's attaching intelligence to labor in a way that creates more questions for humanity, specifically humans with developmental disability and their ability to labor then.
You're right.
So it just opens more doors than maybe it closes. I don't know.
I think you're totally right. But I just think it just lends itself to the complexity of this question, you know? I mean, there is one other thing I wanted to say. This is only a little unrelated, but I don't know if we're going to have a chance to talk about it, and I think Chris will be angry if I don't.
Okay.
But there's something he says in a footnote on page 181. Footnote 9. Does this mean humanity should force the lion to sleep with the lamb? The question that Carissa posed to me is, I'm going to try best to not misconstrue this, but if we consider eating animals to be exploitation, why don't we consider animals eating other animals exploitation, I guess is the simplest way to put that. Mm-hmm. You know, what's the argument there?
Well, I think that the argument there comes to the distinction between human animal and non-human animal. The way I've always explained it in the past, and I know vegans will get on my ass about using the wrong language here or whatever, but like the human animal has evolved beyond the need to do that. We are in a context where we do not need to impart suffering on other sentient beings in order to sustain our own life, so we shouldn't. This is why you get all the time, the number one question vegan gets, like, so if you're stranded on an island, are you going to hunt? You know, are you going to fish?
Yeah.
But like the context there is relevant because one's own survival and one's own survival instinct would become a part of the decision whether or not imparting the suffering on another living creature is necessary. Sentience doesn't necessarily bring along with it a high enough level of intelligence to have moral reasoning. Human animals have the capacity for moral reasoning, and therefore we have the ability to make those choices. Most human animals have the capacity for moral reasoning and therefore have the responsibility to use it when making those choices. Back to the show. Does a lion eating a lamb make me uncomfortable to watch? Certainly. Am I casting moral judgments on a lion eating a lamb? No.
Yeah.
Because the lion is afforded no other option. The lion is in a context where that is their only means of survival.
I think that makes perfect sense. Like in our separation from animality, we've also gained the ability to make the choice to not do that.
I mean, this is a silly example that's come to my mind, and we're both clothed.
Yeah.
Why?
Because
like what I'm saying is like socially we have developed into a situation where we think, I mean, this is puritanical programming really, that where we're made to feel shame about our bodies, but like we wear clothes because we are in a social context where that is deemed morally relevant.
We don't just wear clothing because of a social context. We also wear it because of a natural context.
I mean, there's an environmental need to warm our bodies, to cover our bodies. I'm not a biological essentialist. I think like largely the arguments that Maurizi lobs against Singer comes around that kind of biological essentialism. Mm-hmm. I don't buy into any of that nonsense. Human animals have evolved to a point where we have less and less body hair as time has gone on, as humans have gone up the evolutionary chain. And so clothes have become more of a necessity for that reason in particular climates. To protect us from the sun, to protect us from the cold. Yeah,
you're right. It's not that there isn't a natural solution to those things. It's that we've
evolved beyond it.
Yeah, we've evolved beyond it. You're exactly right. We've evolved beyond it. We don't need to eat meat, right? Animals do need to eat meat. Wow, that was wow. Right? You know, I could see that. Okay, I'll accept that answer. It's the cavalcade of quotes.
We skipped the introduction entirely, but there is a quote that I'd like to call to from it around the concept of justice on page 3. Yeah. Maurizi writes, "Since we are social animals, the only way for us to treat justice as an operative materialist concept is to understand it as social justice. The question of justice arises only when we discuss the relation between human and non-human societies." Valid point. Here's another super quick one on 21. All human culture is mediated brutality. I might use that.
I like that. On like 32, when he's talking about Singer's argument, and he's asking like, did we consider animals to be inferior before we exploited them, or did we exploit them before they became inferior? I just thought that was a really interesting question, but it seems like it has a pretty obvious answer, which is that we exploited animals first and then thought of them inferiorly.
Yeah, I think that's most likely the case. It's a psychological justification for what we should recognize as a morally impermissible action. It's like, well, it's not morally impermissible because they don't have a soul. That's what Descartes.
Oh yeah, I love when he says that Pythagoras was probably more concerned with not eating the souls of his dead friends than any kind of like rational rights and liberty justification. Yeah. That was great. You know, I love on 61, I know that's way ahead, but a Marxist critique of rights does not rely on the idea that communism will be a Garden of Eden, where people are always kind to their neighbor. Communism is the determined negation of a specific mode of production. It embodies its richness and elevates it to a superior level of organization, where free individuals can develop universally, unrestrained by the particular interest of a self-proclaimed elite. Just really nice.
Banger. I would be remiss as the vegan in the room if I didn't point out on 75 at the top of the page, it is true. Veganism does not mean embracing a lifestyle, but rather giving up a death style. That's a fucking banger.
Hell yeah. That's sick as fuck, honestly.
Oh, I would add, he continues, it is not a matter of personal choice. The life that we should focus on is not ours. It is the life of the animals we want to save. And I just appreciate that he brought that up because, again, one of the most common things that vegans hear is, you eat what you want to eat, I'll eat what I want to eat, leave your choices to yourself. Yeah. The whole fucking point is that it's not a personal choice to eat another sentient living creature because they are involved.
What if I have the animals vote and they say, yeah, eat me? Bro, what if we do animal communication and they want us to eat them? Have you thought about that?
Well, actually, you were...
Oh, no.
I don't know if it's going to end up staying in the episode. I don't remember the context. But when you were talking about your buddy that was talking about medical testing, my attitude toward that is that animals cannot consent to medical testing.
Yeah.
I can. I have no problem with humans consenting to medical testing.
That's wild.
I mean,
I'm not saying that's crazy like that.
I recognize that most of the people that are going to be doing so are doing so under the coercive forces of capital, and therefore are doing it because likely they have no other option, just like why most people sell their fucking plasma and shit.
Yeah.
But in a utopian ideal situation, and someone was like, I would like to give up my body for the advancement of science, I am willing to take the test.
Test it on me, doctor. Leave that poor rabbit alone.
I think that is considerably more morally permissible than testing on a non-consenting animal.
I honestly think that's a fucking great answer, because I was racking my brain trying to think of an alternative to animal testing. I mean, obviously there are alternatives, but I didn't consider, if you need an animal to test it on, man is the animal.
Well, the other thing about that, and you'll hear this endlessly from other vegans, is that most animal testing is not even
Completely
a particularly
useless.
good litmus test.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, also, it's all for shit like lipstick and stuff. I mean, they do all sorts of crazy testing.
Ohio company Procter & Gamble, well known for their animal testing, would cut the eyelids off of bunnies to spray shit into their eyes to test if it was volatile or whatever. Really fucking...
I thought y'all were chemists. You couldn't tell me that from the get?
terrible fucking... Ugh, the worst.
Yeah.
I have another one here on 107, if that's okay.
Totally.
This is a quote that he's pulling from Marx, but this is the block quote. I paint the capitalist and the landlord in no sense couleur de rose, or however you'd say it. But here individuals are dealt with only insofar as they are the personifications of economic categories, embodiments of particular class relations and class interests. My standpoint, from which the evolution of the economic formation of society is viewed as a process of natural history, can less than any other make the individual responsible for relations whose creature he socially remains, however much he may subjectively raise himself above them. And my response to that is, find me a communist who doesn't fucking call all slumlords scum. The idea that we do not look at the individual under the coercive forces of capital and still make some sort of value judgment is stupid. Sorry, Marx.
I was just thinking about how we call cops pigs. What's up with that?
I don't like that.
Yeah.
Pigs are way more intelligent than cops.
Hell yeah. I was trying to figure out the context for this quote on 93, where he says, the Irish man has only one need left, the need to eat, and eat potatoes. More precisely, to eat rotten potatoes, the worst kind of potatoes.
Why is he coming after my people?
I'm sure there's a reason, but I didn't write down why.
Yeah, I don't have...
I did highlight it, though. Potatoes aren't indigenous to Europe. I'll leave it at that.
I would like to just pull two banger quotes from the Frankfurt School. First, an Adorno quote on 149. No universal history leads from savagery to humanitarianism, but there is one leading from the slingshot to the megaton bomb. That's a fucking banger.
Hell yeah.
And then also just a couple pages further on 153, we get a great Marcuse quote. Marcuse wrote, no free society is imaginable which does not, under its regulative idea of reason, make the concerted effort to reduce consistently the suffering which man imposes on the animal world. Hell yeah, Marcuse.
Oh yeah. I really appreciated that when we read One Dimensional Man. A lot of this, I'm looking back on 149 because there's that quote there. The intrinsic logic of such unstoppable historical force is, in fact, entirely binary. Yes, no, reason, madness, progress, reaction, science, magic. Those who hesitate in front of these alternatives, those who try to question the genesis of such options, are automatically excommunicated and expelled from the circle of reasonable people. That's kind of what I was getting at earlier when I was talking about the foundation of science and knowledge, being on domination, is that if you question the rationality of domination, then you're said to be irrational. Pretty much.
Yeah.
So, every scientist who acts as if nature were brute matter at his/her service is secretly a priest. Every vulgar materialist who practices domination over the rest of the living world is secretly a spiritualist, be it an avid capitalist or a communist convinced that Earth belongs to humans. To be a materialist today means knowing that we are not masters and we must stop behaving as if we were.
Great line.
No gods, no masters, right? What are we talking about here? Neither are we.
Okay, on 184, Maurizi writes, veganism is thus the necessary, although not sufficient, step toward a proper understanding of what a free relation between natural individuals means. Couldn't agree more.
Hell yeah.
So that was Beyond Nature, Animal Liberation, Marxism, and Critical Theory by Marco Maurizi. What questions did this leave you with, Will?
how best can we keep animals in mind, man? How best can we be considerate of animal liberation in our struggle? Just to talk about communications for a second, I mean, it's not that this is a dangerous game to play, but I think that this is probably the topic that you'd have the most people not happy with you about. I think that communists are really very willing to accept many, 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 many people and many, 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 any struggle, really. But I think that this is a difficult one for them to take. And I'm just wondering how best it would be to go about that. Is it just to sit down and have that kind of dialogue with those people? I mean, how do you build the base again? Just a much more practical question, because it's not a very practical book.
Yeah, I would agree with that. And I think the question that I had, he actually writes himself. And I was like, that's a very good question. He doesn't give us an answer. It's on 183. For some context, he's talking about the Frankfurt School here. He says, what Adorno, Horkheimer, and Marcuse underline is that only if organizational efforts and direct actions are consistent with the idea of human and non-human liberation can they hope to trigger the epochal change they dream of. Yet to be consistent with such an idea, as we have seen, implies that the entire structure of civilization is put into question. Thus, how can political groups and single activists coordinate such a task with their everyday activity amid the urgency of economic and ecological crisis while facing the horrors of human and non-human exploitation?
Yeah.
I would agree, and I would argue that that question is not limited to animal liberation. I think any of the things that we've discussed here, that's the question that I feel most strongly in my gut every single time is like, so many people are just, myself included, are just fucking trying to survive, trying to get by.
Yeah.
How do we face true mobilized organization where we can bring together all of these disparate individualistic political actions into something that is singularly organized while also just fucking surviving the hellscape of modern life?
Yeah. Survival is heavy on my mind, man, because very snidely I was like, why don't we do plant liberation next? But that's just nature. And what we're talking about ultimately is the ecology, If we're talking about the impending doom of this world, right? It is important to understand that all of our forms of oppression are leading to that destruction. Even if we abolish capitalism, if we're simply recreating these methods of essentially natural destruction, we will not solve an environmental crisis. Solve in an ideal sense. But I just think that that's really, really important to realize, and I think it's part of going beyond nature. We're not talking about domination of nature. At this point, we're talking about survival in nature, I just think that that's really key.
Agreed. Yeah, I really kind of expected to get a little bit more in the ecological environmental argument here.
Yeah, me too.
Largely because...
This is a book from 2023, dude.
Yeah, he's a fucking modern writer.
Yeah.
He is also staring down the barrel of complete ecological collapse. And to be frank, there are a lot of quote-unquote environmental vegans that the reason they are vegan is because they recognize the connection that what we consume has with the deterioration of our fucking ecosystem.
Yeah.
I welcome them to the club and hope that they listen more about anti-speciesist animal liberation, but I expected to get more out of the book. I was a little disappointed that we didn't, to be honest.
Yeah. Just in that kind of hand-wavy way, just to change the systems, just think about the better solution and it'll all align itself.
Yeah.
No, that's too cynical, but...
Well, the other question I haven't phrased it, I haven't written it in my notes. It's just something that was sitting with me and that I kind of thought we would get into during our discussion and we didn't, is around this like discomfort between individual action and the necessary systemic change. Like, I think obviously I have a position on what our individual action toward animal liberation should be, even though I don't think our action should be limited to that individualism. Because I think there are a lot of examples of things that we do as individuals that are not in and of themselves going to have the sweeping systematic change that is necessary. Like the BDS movement or recycling, shit like that we do, even though we know that me being the one that does it isn't going to be the thing that changes anything. My question is around like, how do I get more people to fucking consider veganism in that scope? Because I think it's so easily dismissed as like, you being vegan doesn't do anything to change the factory farming industry, which, though it has an air of legitimacy, I think is mostly just a deflection. I don't know. There's a question in there. What is the way to get folks to see their individual connection while also working toward a collective systemic change?
My biggest thought was that it lies in mutual understanding. Something he says in here is that it's not to force every member of your cadre to become vegan. I think that it's just more of an ongoing process than that. Like, we're working towards one goal, and which is liberation, and then you just kind of have to keep adding to that goal. But what I was thinking is that the fact that people do think like this means that everyone could think like this, that like the thinking has been done. It's not a matter of convincing people is what I want to say. It's because there are people that can't be convinced. I mean, people will be convinced by their surroundings. So some people will be convinced by creating better surroundings. Some people will be convinced along the way. That's not some long-termist goal. It's just to say that, like, I think a focus on individualistic veganism in that sense is, I don't know, it's not in line with that same kind of process to me. I'm thinking about when he talks about Gary Francione and he says, once a certain amount of people go vegan, all the factories will close down. It's like, it's just a different process than that, Yeah. It's not about critical mass. It's more so about an overall acceptance of the upcoming revolution, essentially. Thinking about revolution in a sense of people accepting a change in production, that's the same kind of thing we're talking about, accepting what will fulfill their needs. Rather than being animal products, it could be something else.
Okay, last punch. I move off of Will's point without really addressing it, and I'd just like to throw out there, the issue of speciesism is an urgent one, claiming literally billions of land animals' lives annually and trillions, including sea life, each year. So I would implore every individual to consider their stake in the matter even before revolution begins. The consequences of inaction are dire, and though I agree with Will that Francione's idea of critical mass will shift capitalism is misguided, I do believe we have an individual responsibility to act in accordance with our goals for a liberated world. Back to the show last time. Something that literally just came to my mind, and I'll probably butcher, is like, we know that working in the animal slaughter industry is like some of the most grueling work anyone can do, and it's among the most exploited workers, I would imagine, that when a proletarian revolution comes, those folks are not readily going to return to that work.
Yeah.
Because once they have the means of subsistence, once they have control over the means of subsistence and are no longer forced under the coercion of capital to work in those conditions, rethinking those conditions would probably be just a natural kind of next step.
To me, it comes back to the way we've domesticated animals, too. I think it's specifically of sheep, like if you don't shear them, they go blind or whatever, they die. They can't survive in the wild, that kind of thing. It's like, what will happen to those animals? Animals that we've specifically created for this, something will have to happen to them. I don't want to get too focused on that kind of thing, but like, are we talking about large-scale, domestic partnership like you guys are talking about with your cats, sanctuaries and things? Like, that's just an interesting question to think about, because we have changed animals in so many ways. We've changed nature in so many ways that even honestly, to think of reverting them back to a natural state is too primitivist. Like, we're not looking to go back to some natural ideal, some, pre-Neolithic fucking perfect animal, right, where horses were the sizes of dogs or whatever. We're talking about going beyond. We're talking about going future. It's all a computer. No, we're talking about going to the future. We're going beyond nature. We're transcending that idea. And it's just unanswerable questions. But, like, what does that future look like is interesting to me.
Yeah.
We should read this book if.
You should read this book if. You should go first.
You're a sinner. You know that? We are perfectly positioned to read this book, I hope you know. Not many people are in the same position as us to say, like, yeah, I'll just pick this up. You should read this, I think, I think two ways, right? If you're an animal liberationist who is uncomfortable with Marxism, you should read this. If you're a Marxist who's uncomfortable with animal liberation, you should read this too. That's probably the simplest way I can put it. I found it to be satisfying.
Yeah, what I was struggling to come up with as my response is I agree with both of those. I did want to read this book because I am an animal liberationist Marxist who wanted to better understand the theoretical framework that connects those two ideas. And I'm not sure that I got everything out of it that I wanted. So I feel like it's unfair of me to say, if you are like me, a vegan Marxist and who wants to see the theoretical connection between those two ideas, you should read this book. Certainly I got things out of it, but I don't know that I got what I wanted in that context out of it. Though that's really unfair. I guess I did. It was very challenging in my understanding of my anti-speciesist animal liberationism and in my understanding as a Marxist. So you should read this book if you are a vegan Marxist.
Period.
Yeah.
I was going to say that if you're interested in an elaboration of the Frankfurt School in their quest against the domination of nature, I guess. I think that this is an interesting addition to that conversation as well. Not that we've read that much, and we haven't read anything else that relates to that, So if you're a critical theorist, maybe you just went, this guy's an idiot. But I think it was interesting.
I really enjoyed when we read One Dimensional Man. I did think it was kind of a tough read at times, but I did enjoy it quite a lot. Reading this has reawakened in my appreciation for the Frankfurt School in general.
Yeah.
I felt a kinship with them, at least in the stuff that was being quoted from Maurizi. So, yeah.
Word. What are we reading next?
Next, we are continuing our reading of Capital, this time reading chapters 10 and 11.
All right. Listener, we want to hear from you, obviously. What did you think of the book if you read it? What did you think of our interpretation if you heard it? Obviously, you heard it. What else? What else should we read?
I'm very interested to know if there are any other vegan Marxists out there that are like, this is the book you should read if you are looking to connect the dots between animal liberation and proletarian liberation.
It's such a it's so niche. It's a very hyper specific thing.
I feel so deeply in my gut a parallel connection between these struggles, between the struggle for animal liberation and the struggle for human liberation. And I just feel like an idiot because I don't feel like I can articulate those things, that connection clearly enough. So if someone has read something that they think does articulate that well, please send us that recommendation at leftunreadfeedback@gmail.com.
Yeah.
Join us next time in our reading of Capital, chapters 10 through 11, because you do not want to get left
Unread. See ya.
Bye.